The maps were already bleeding when the final day began. The bunker lamps flickered over the war table, casting long, trembling shadows across the red pins that were spreading like infections over what was left of Hitler's shrinking empire. Somewhere above ground, artillery thundered so violently that dust drifted from the ceiling in thin gray sheets, settling over the maps like ash falling over a grave. At that moment, 2:07 a.m., April 29th, Hitler stood barefoot on the cold concrete floor, staring at the Eastern Front like a man interrogating a corpse. His hair was uncombed, his robe half open, his hands shaking not just from illness but from something far more dangerous, the realization that each hour was turning the maps red faster than his mind could process. And yet, when the officer on night duty stepped into the room, Hitler turned toward him with a strange, eerie calm. "Tell me," Hitler whispered, "what remains?" The question wasn't about territory. It wasn't about divisions or battalions or bridges or rivers. The officer felt it immediately. Hitler was asking what remained of him, of the Reich, of the myth, of the years he spent crafting an empire that was evaporating with every shell that hit Berlin. And before the officer could answer, Hitler added something even more unsettling. "Don't lie to me tonight." That was the exact moment the officer realized the truth. Hitler already knew the answer he feared most. The officer swallowed hard, stepping closer to the table, the paper crackling under his boots. When he leaned in, he saw the red encirclement tightening around the city. Pincer arrows cut through the districts they had defended just hours earlier. Soviet positions, once distant dots, were now pressed against the very outskirts of the Reich Chancellery. Only a single corridor of contested streets remained open, and even that was closing. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any words came, Hitler leaned on the table so heavily that the wooden frame groaned beneath him. The map was trembling. Or his hands were. Or both. "How quickly?" Hitler asked. Not, "How many?" Not, "Where are our reserves?" But, "How quickly?" The officer tried to respond, but the bunker suddenly shook with a deafening blast that dimmed the lights and rattled the steel doors. Something above had collapsed. Another floor, another building, another piece of the world that had once answered to him. When the vibration faded, Hitler sighed through clenched teeth. That was close. And just when the officer thought Hitler would demand a counterattack plan, a breakout plan, any plan, Hitler straightened, looked at the red-marked streets, and whispered something the officer would remember for the rest of his life. "This map is lying to me." The officer froze. He had heard Hitler deny reality before, but never like this. There was no rage, no theatrical speeches, no wild claims of phantom divisions approaching. Just a quiet, fragile delusion trying to protect itself. "They exaggerate," Hitler said, tapping the red pins with a trembling finger. "They want me to believe we are encircled. They want me to panic." The officer didn't dare speak. But then Hitler turned and stared directly into his eyes. "You don't believe the map, do you?" For a moment, Hitler seemed almost childlike, seeking reassurance, validation, some fragile thread of loyalty to cling to. And the officer, terrified, gave a small nod he immediately regretted. Hitler smiled at that, a small, ghost-like smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Good," Hitler whispered. "Good. Then there is still hope." But hope was the lie, and they both knew it. The truth was in the rumble of artillery shaking the floor. The truth was in the smell of smoke drifting through the ventilation shafts. The truth was in the distant cries echoing through the broken city streets above them. The officer glanced back at the map and felt a cold wave crawl up his spine. He realized then that the map wasn't lying. Not at all. It was Hitler who could no longer bear to see the truth printed in red ink. And just as the officer prepared to tell him, the lights flickered again, collapsing the moment into deeper darkness. The officer took a breath. "Mein Führer," he whispered. "The Soviets have reached the Tiergarten. We have no reserves left. The last corridor will fall by morning." Hitler didn't answer. He simply stared at one particular red arrow pressing against the city center. His face was drained of emotion. His breathing slowed. For several seconds, the bunker was silent. Then Hitler whispered, almost to himself, "All of them, so quickly." He wasn't talking about armies. He was talking about years, decisions, dreams, delusions, everything collapsing in a single night. Another officer entered the room, handed over a new report, and spoke the words no one wanted to hear. "The Soviets are 2 streets away." Hitler closed his eyes. The officer waited for rage, for a tantrum, for denial. But instead, Hitler nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had finally accepted deep inside. "Then we are already dead." The officer stepped back. Hitler wasn't shouting. He wasn't trembling with fury. He was speaking plainly, clearly, as if the war had just ended, not outside the bunker, but inside him. And just when the officer thought Hitler had surrendered to despair, Hitler suddenly stepped forward and placed his hand on the table with new, unsettling determination. "Bring me the others," he said quietly. "Every map must be corrected. Every division accounted for. I will speak to each of them, one by one." The officer shivered. Because the look in Hitler's eyes wasn't hope and wasn't madness. It was something colder, something hollow. As if he needed to hear each officer admit what he already knew. The maps weren't lying. The Reich wasn't standing. And by morning, Berlin would belong to someone else entirely. Before he left, the officer glanced once more at the map. The red lines weren't spreading. They were blooming, choking out the black ink like veins turning to poison. And deep inside, he wondered whether Hitler would accept the truth by sunrise, or whether he would destroy everyone who dared bring it to him. A deep boom echoed overhead. Dust filled the air. Somewhere in the bunker, someone screamed. And with that, the officer realized the next 24 hours would not simply end the war. They would strip away the last illusions of a man who had reshaped the world through fear. The corridor outside the map room grew colder as officers gathered in uneasy silence, each clutching reports they no longer believed in. None wanted to be the first summoned, yet every man there knew his turn was coming. The bunker smelled of sweat, concrete dust, and diesel fumes from the failing generators, an airless cocktail that clung to the skin. Somewhere deep within the walls, pipes groaned as the building settled under the relentless pounding above. It felt less like a headquarters now, and more like a tomb waiting for the last shovel of earth. The adjutant stepped out and called the first name. A major, once celebrated for his efficiency, now pale and trembling, straightened his uniform and entered the war room. The door closed behind him with a soft click that made the others flinch. Minutes passed. 5, then 10, then 15. When he finally emerged, his face was waxy, drained of color. His hands trembled so violently that his papers slipped from his grip and scattered across the floor. One officer bent to help him gather them. The major jolted backward as if struck. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "He asked me," the major whispered, voice cracking, "when I first knew the war was lost." A hush fell over the corridor. No one spoke. No one breathed. They all knew the truth they had buried under layers of obedience. They had known for months. But the major wasn't finished. His lips trembled. "When I hesitated," he smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a reassuring one. A smile hollowed out by paranoia and the need to confirm betrayal. They didn't have time to process this before another explosion shook the bunker. A steel plate rattled loose from the ceiling, crashing to the floor with a metallic shriek that echoed down the hallway. Lights flickered again. An extinguished lamp lay smoking in a corner. A few of the younger officers exchanged glances, half expecting the bunker to cave in. The world above was disintegrating. Below, minds were trembling in unison. Inside the war room, Hitler stood before the map like a man facing judgment. Every minute, a runner rushed in with fresh updates that only added more red to the board. A Soviet spearhead had breached another defensive line. Another battalion had surrendered. Streets that had been German just hours ago were now listed as contested or lost. Hitler's fingers traced the red lines over and over, as though by touching them he could reverse them. He paused at one sector and muttered. This was supposed to hold for 3 days. It was held for 3 hours. He called in the next officer, a colonel who had once boasted of victory in every briefing. Now his confidence looked like a broken mask. Hitler gestured to the map. "Explain this," he said quietly. The softness of his voice made it even more terrifying. The colonel tried to speak, but the words stumbled out of his mouth in fragments. Hitler tilted his head slightly, waiting, watching the man unravel. Finally, the colonel admitted. The Soviets broke through faster than anticipated. Hitler's breathing tightened. Faster, he repeated. Or did our men flee? The colonel swallowed hard. He had seen this moment coming, this hour when truth could no longer be disguised as strategy. Our forces were overwhelmed, mein Führer. They had no ammunition left. Hitler closed his eyes. The colonel's next words came out barely above a whisper. Many could not continue fighting. Could not would not. Hitler heard the distinction immediately. His eyes snapped open. Cowards, he snarled. Weaklings. But even as he said it, his shoulders sagged. His fury no longer carried weight. It sounded thin, brittle, almost exhausted. When he dismissed the colonel, the officer's knees nearly buckled from relief. The next few hours blurred into a grim procession. Officers entered the war room stiffly and left it hollowed out. Some cried silently. Some stared into space. A few whispered apologies to no one. As dawn approached, though no sunlight could reach them here, the bunker temperature seemed to drop further, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the despair. At 6:14 a.m., a messenger burst in with a dire report. The last anti-tank guns protecting the government district had been overrun. Berlin's defenses were now just pockets of exhausted boys and old men. Hitler listened with eyes half-lidded, his breathing shallow. "Show me," he whispered. The messenger led him to the map table. Hitler's gaze followed the red lines as they touched, merged, and finally circled the city center fully. There was no longer a corridor. No longer an exit. Only a red ring, a noose tightening around the bunker. The room fell silent. A few officers looked away, unable to witness what they knew was coming. Hitler stared at the map for so long that some wondered if he had stopped breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older, fragile, papery. "So, this is it." No one responded. Then he straightened, surprising everyone. His eyes sharpened, not with clarity or purpose, but something more dangerous, a final, desperate delusion. "We will break the encirclement," he whispered. "We will push them back. I will lead it myself." The officers exchanged horrified glances. This was no longer a strategy. This was fantasy. The map was red. The streets above were gone. The army he imagined no longer existed. One officer, a man who had served him for over a decade, stepped forward cautiously. "Mein Führer, we have no tanks left. No artillery. Our ammunition. Enough." Hitler roared, slamming his fist into the table so hard the map rippled beneath his hand. "You speak of limits when we stand at the edge of destiny." The room fell into terrified silence. For a moment, Hitler's posture straightened, and he looked like the man who had once commanded continents. But the illusion shattered when his hand trembled again. He sank down into his chair. His voice softened, almost breaking. "Why would they abandon me now?" It wasn't a political question. It wasn't a military one. It was the question of a man betrayed by the myth he once embodied. The officer whispered, "They have no strength left." Hitler stared at the map again. Slowly, almost tenderly, he placed his hand above one of the few black pins remaining. "Neither do I," he whispered. Outside, the bunker shook again. Red dust drifted down. Somewhere in the darkness, a light bulb popped. And for the first time in years, Hitler looked afraid. By mid-morning, the bunker had shifted from a command center into something like a waiting room for the end of the world. The officers no longer moved with military purpose. They drifted like men carrying invisible weights. Every step echoed with the knowledge that Berlin was no longer a city, but a battlefield grave disguised in smoke and collapsing stone. The air inside the bunker was thick and stale, stirred only when someone rushed through a corridor with a new report, each one worse than the last. Hitler remained at the war table, refusing rest, refusing food, refusing anything that might force him to acknowledge the physical weakness creeping into his limbs. His robe had been exchanged for a uniform, but it hung loosely on him now, as if the fabric no longer recognized the man inside it. His boots were unlaced. His medals were crooked. His breathing came in shallow, uneven draws, but still he asked for updates. Still he demanded reports. Still he tried to command the red ink back into black. At 10:03 a.m., an officer entered with a message that should have been impossible. Soviet troops were now visible from the chancellery's upper floors. Hitler blinked several times as if the words were too absurd to process. Visible? He repeated. The officer nodded. With binoculars, he said. Some without. A brittle silence followed. Hitler steadied himself on the table. That close, he whispered. So quickly. He stepped closer to the map, tracing one trembling finger along the red line cutting through Wilmersdorf. There were reinforcements here, he muttered. An armored regiment, where is it? The officer hesitated. He had dreaded this question. Destroyed, mein Führer. Yesterday afternoon. Hitler's hand froze midair. For several seconds, he stared at the map as though confronting a personal betrayal. All of them? The officer nodded. Hitler closed his eyes. In the hallway outside, a bomb struck so close the concrete floor quivered. Loose dust rained onto a desk, onto the shoulders of a secretary, who didn't even bother to dust herself off. She stared blankly at her typewriter, a machine she no longer needed because there was nothing left to type. No orders. No directives. No future. In the map room, Hitler inhaled sharply and forced himself upright. Show me the Western Front, he commanded. An adjutant unrolled another map, its edges curled from months of use. But even before it was fully unfurled, Hitler saw the truth. Red arrows advancing from the Rhine, from the Main, from the Elbe. The Western map was turning the same color as the Eastern one, an unstoppable tide. No, Hitler said, shaking his head. No, this is wrong. These positions, these divisions, were intact last week. The adjutant swallowed. Last week, yes, he whispered. Hitler looked up slowly, disbelief etched across his face. What happened? The adjutant's voice cracked. They surrendered. Hitler clutched the edge of the table. Surrendered. The word echoed in the room like something obscene. My generals, he whispered, pacing backward. My officers. My soldiers. They leave me now. But even as he said it, he knew they hadn't left him now. They had left long ago. The moment the myth cracked, the moment the illusion broke, the moment reality seeped through the propaganda, his armies had stopped fighting for him. They had simply kept running on momentum until the machine fell apart. Another officer arrived, carrying a fresh casualty report. Hitler waved him forward with a trembling hand. The officer opened the folder and hesitated. His mouth struggled to form the words. Finally, he managed. The Ninth Army is no longer functioning as a unified force. Hitler frowned. Then where is it? The officer looked down. Everywhere, he whispered. And nowhere. Hitler slammed his palm onto the table hard enough to rattle the pins. Cowards, he spat. Traitors. But the room did not react with fear. It reacted with pity. For a moment, the officer speaking, who had once feared Hitler with every cell of his being, felt a strange shift inside himself. It was like watching an actor repeat their final lines long after the audience has left. The rage was no longer terrifying, it was sad. Diminished. Hollow. Hitler's breathing turned ragged. This map, he said, was my world. His fingers grazed the lines again. But it doesn't answer anymore. By noon, the Soviets were only a few hundred meters from the bunker entrance. Several officers asked about evacuation routes, but every route had already been swallowed by the red ink. A few whispered among themselves, fear turning to practicality. They weren't discussing tactics anymore. They were discussing survival. But every time Hitler approached, the whispers dissolved into rigid silence. Then came a report that broke something deep inside him. A runner rushed in, panting, covered in dust. Mein Führer, he said. The flak tower has ceased fire. Hitler blinked. Why? The runner swallowed, trying to catch his breath. Ammunition, gone. Hitler stared. His silence was more terrifying than his shouts. Gone? His voice trembled. An entire tower? The runner nodded. Hitler pressed both hands against the table, shaking his head in disbelief. It cannot be. They were supposed to hold. He couldn't finish the sentence. The Flak Tower had been one of Berlin's last remaining symbols of defense, a mountain of steel and concrete. Its silence meant something no one dared say aloud. Berlin was undefended. Inside the bunker, word spread like a cold wind. Officers glanced at the ceiling, imagining the bombs falling unhindered. One whispered, "This is the end." Another muttered, "We'll be buried alive." Hitler didn't hear them. He remained fixated on the map, staring at the Flak Tower symbol as though willing it to resurrect itself. "They will fight," he whispered. "They must fight. They must." But the truth was everywhere now. It was in the shaking hands of his officers. It was in the red ink swallowing the borders. It was in the distant screams filtering through ventilation shafts. It was in the bunker's oppressive silence whenever a new report arrived. At 12:47 p.m., Hitler stepped back from the map. His shoulders sagged. His voice cracked as he whispered, "There is nothing left to command." The officers exchanged glances. Something irreversible had happened. A psychological line had been crossed. And though Hitler didn't yet realize it, the last 24 hours had entered their final descent. By early afternoon, the bunker had developed its own kind of silence, one so dense it felt physical, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Officers avoided eye contact. Secretaries paused mid-typing, fingers hovering above the keys as if unsure whether any message still mattered. The distant thunder of artillery no longer startled anyone. It was simply the heartbeat of a dying city. But inside the map room, something far more volatile than explosions was unfolding. Hitler remained rooted to the table, his face drained of color, his shoulders hunched inward like a man folding into himself. His eyes darted across the maps with a frantic, feverish energy, searching for a line, a unit, a corridor, something he could still command into existence. But every time he looked away, another red marker slid across the table. Every time a runner entered, Hitler's gaze snapped toward him like a predator cornered. And each time the news was the same: more losses, more red, more collapse. At 1:23 p.m., an aide approached with trembling hands, offering a slip of paper. Hitler unfolded it slowly, almost ritualistically. His eyes scanned the message, and something inside him flickered. Some final ember of denial trying to reignite. "This can't be true," he whispered. The aide lowered his head. "It has been confirmed, mein Führer." Hitler's fingers tightened until the paper crumpled in his fist. "The 12th Army was supposed to relieve Berlin," he muttered. "They were supposed to come from the west. Why haven't they come?" The aide swallowed. "They cannot move. The Americans blocked them." Hitler's face twitched. "Americans," he hissed. "Then let them fight the Americans. They must reach Berlin." The aide hesitated, then whispered the truth. "They can't, mein Führer. They surrendered this morning." Hitler froze. His breath hitched. His eyes widened in disbelief. Not theatrical, not political, but raw and wounded, like a man discovering betrayal for the first time. "Surrendered," he repeated, voice thinning into something brittle. "My generals." He lifted his head slowly, staring at the ceiling as if speaking to an unseen audience. "All my life I've been surrounded by traitors." No one corrected him. No one dared. But inside, every officer in the room thought the same thing. Hitler wasn't surrounded by traitors. He was surrounded by exhaustion, starvation, futility, and a truth he could no longer contain. Another explosion rocked the bunker, closer than any before. Dust sifted down from the ceiling like snowfall. Several officers flinched instinctively. Hitler didn't move. He kept staring at the red lines tightening around the city, his lips moving silently, calculating, rewriting, erasing, reimagining. His mind flickered like a failing light bulb. At 2:05 p.m., he did something no one expected. He asked for the civilian casualty numbers. The bunker staff froze. Hitler had never requested those figures. Civilian suffering had been irrelevant to him, abstract at best. But now his voice wavered. "Show me," he whispered, "what the people have lost." When the numbers were read aloud, tens of thousands dead, tens of thousands injured, thousands trapped under rubble, Hitler squeezed his eyes shut. His jaw trembled. "They should have fought harder," he whispered. "They should have defended their Führer." The room held its breath. Even the officers who had served him for years felt a shift, a crack splitting across the myth. Because for the first time, Hitler wasn't angry at the enemy. He was angry at the German people for dying. Minutes later, more reports arrived. Soviet infantry was now within 2 blocks of the Chancellery Gardens. Berlin's center, his center, was dissolving. Hitler pressed his hands to the table, leaning over the eastern map until his forehead nearly touched it. His voice came out low, hoarse, broken. "We built this to last 1,000 years. An officer whispered so quietly he thought no one would hear. "It lasted 12. Hitler's head snapped upward. His eyes were wild. "Who said that?" Silence. Cold, suffocating silence. Hitler scanned each face. But the bunker had become a room of masks, expressionless, obedient, but hollow. He straightened slowly. "Bring in the remaining officers," he commanded. "All of them." One by one, they filed in, forming a ring around the war table. Hitler stood in the center, illuminated by a flickering lamp that made his shadow warp grotesquely across the wall. He pointed to the map, the one now almost entirely red. "This," he said softly, "is not defeat. This is betrayal." No one nodded. No one agreed. No one offered comfort. They simply stood there, their silence more damning than any spoken accusation. And then Hitler did something none of them could have prepared for. He asked, "Who still believes we can win?" The officers stared at the floor. Not a single hand moved. Not a single voice rose. Not even the most loyal, the most indoctrinated, the most terrified dared utter a lie. The truth had become too loud, too red, too undeniable. Hitler looked around the room with a strange, detached calm, as if observing strangers rather than the men who had carried out his orders for years. "So," he whispered, "that is how easily faith dies." He lifted a red marker pin from the table and rolled it between his fingers. "A map changes, and so do men." One officer finally spoke, voice trembling. "Mein Führer, the city is gone. The army is gone. There is nothing left to command." Hitler turned to him slowly. "Nothing," he murmured. "No. There is always something left." The officer's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" Hitler stepped closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "A final act." A shiver swept through the room. Not a single man misunderstood. But before anyone could respond, a shockwave rippled through the bunker. Dust billowed along the ceiling. Light bulbs shattered. Papers scattered. Someone yelled for medics. An officer stumbled backward into the wall, coughing. The Soviets had reached the surface directly above the bunker. This was no longer a shrinking map. This was the end physically breaking through the concrete. Hitler steadied himself on the table, breathing heavily. His voice cracked into a whisper almost lost in the chaos. "The red reaches even here." For the first time, no one contradicted him. He was right. And they all knew it. By late afternoon, the reality that had been creeping into the bunker for days finally stood in the room without disguise. The maps were no longer maps, they were warnings. Every front, every district, every last defensive line had been swallowed by red ink. Even the small paper flags marking friendly units had begun to curl and fall off the board, like they too were surrendering to the inevitable. The bunker smelled of damp concrete, sweat, and gunpowder leaking downward through ventilation shafts. The walls trembled with each new impact. The electricity flickered and groaned. Yet none of it was as unsettling as the expression on Hitler's face as he stood in front of the Eastern District map for the last time. His hand hovered over the lines, trembling uncontrollably. Every time he tried to place a marker, the shaking worsened, until he let the marker fall from his fingers altogether. The room was quiet. Officers stood at attention, but not in discipline. In silence. In dread. In the kind of stillness that comes from witnessing a human mind slip through its final cracks. Hitler's breath rasped. He leaned closer to the map until his nose nearly touched the surface. "They're at the gates," he whispered. "The Russians, they're at my gates." Outside, something enormous exploded, shaking dust loose from the ceiling in thick sheets. It coated their uniforms, their hair, their boots. A secretary coughed. Another wiped tears that weren't from emotion, but from the dust stinging her eyes. And yet, Hitler didn't move. He kept staring at the one thin sliver of unmarked territory left around the bunker. It was barely the size of a fingernail. At 4:42 p.m., an adjutant entered, his face pale, clutching a fresh field report. "Mein Führer, the Red Army has crossed Wilhelmstrasse. They've breached the last barricade." Hitler closed his eyes. A long, shaking sigh escaped his lips. "What remains?" he asked again. The adjutant swallowed. "Nothing, Mein Führer. Nothing remains." For a moment, Hitler didn't speak. Didn't breathe. Didn't blink. Then his shoulders dropped. Not in surrender, not in defeat, but in something colder. Acceptance that the world he built was gone. He asked for the Western map again. It was even worse. American armor was pushing across the Elbe. The British were deep into the northern districts. The French pressed from the southwest. Red. Blue. Red. Blue. The colors blended into a tapestry of collapse. Hitler studied the Western map long enough for the officers to exchange glances. He hadn't looked at it this long since the war's early years. "So," he whispered, "there will be nothing left of Germany." The room tensed. Everyone anticipated another rant, another insistence that Germany deserved to perish with him. But instead he said something none of them expected. "I gave them nothing to survive with." A crack raced silently through the room. For the first time, Hitler wasn't blaming his generals, or his allies, or his soldiers, or the weather or fate. He was blaming himself. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to pause in their flicker. Officers looked around, stunned. Not because the words were profound, but because they were honest. And honesty, here, was more terrifying than delusion. At 5:18 p.m., Soviet artillery began firing directly onto the Chancellery Gardens. The bunker vibrated continuously now, like a heartbeat synchronized with the bombs. The ceiling groaned. Dust fell with every exhale. The oxygen felt thinner. Hitler's breathing grew ragged. His voice, when he spoke, came out in shallow gasps. "Bring me the casualty reports," he ordered. An aide handed them over. Hitler scanned several pages until his hands began trembling too violently to continue. The papers slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor. He sank into his chair. His eyes turned empty. "Millions," he whispered. "Millions gone for this." Officers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others clenched their jaws, the truth hitting them now that there was no Reich left to hide behind. No ideology powerful enough to shield them from the scale of destruction. All that remained was the sound of the bombs and the suffocating pressure of guilt. At 6:02 p.m., a secretary brought news that forced the final admission. "Mein Führer, Soviet infantry have been spotted entering the gardens." Hitler stared at her. "They're here." She nodded. And for the first time in years, Hitler looked afraid. Not of death, but of being alive long enough to face the consequences. He rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. "Prepare the room," he murmured. The secretary hesitated. "Mein Führer, what room?" Hitler didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in the bunker knew. The officers watched him walk away with a stiffness that looked like resignation wrapped in despair. Some stepped aside to make room for him. Others turned their faces to the wall, so they wouldn't need to watch the passing of a man they once feared more than death. When he was gone, the officers moved toward the map table almost instinctively. They stood in silence, staring at the red expanse covering Europe. For the first time, no one made excuses. No one invented phantom regiments. No one spoke of counterattacks or miracle weapons. They simply breathed together, heavy and defeated, facing the truth they had avoided for years. One officer whispered, "It's all gone." Another replied, "No, it was gone long before this." The room fell into a mournful silence. Not grief. Not relief. Something deeper. Something heavier. The moment when an entire ideology evaporates in the face of undeniable reality. At 7:12 p.m., the ground shook with the violence of a final bombardment. Shouts echoed through the bunker. Lights flickered out. For a few seconds, the world fell into darkness. Then the emergency lamps buzzed to life, dim and reddish, casting the bunker in a ghostly glow. The officers looked around at their faces, gaunt, pale, hollow. One man whispered, "The Führer is making his decision." Another replied, "And soon, we must make ours." They all turned back to the map. The one that had guided them, deceived them, defined them. The one now so red it looked like a wound spreading across the table. It no longer mattered what Hitler said next. The maps had spoken. The city had spoken. History had spoken. And in the final hours of the final day, the truth was all that remained. The war was over. The Reich was gone. And the bunker was simply waiting for its last breath.